Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. Well, what an honor to be here with you all, and I want to thank Michelle and Soren for hosting us here. What we're going to do now is talk about the science of relationships and community. And to do this, we're going to go on a pretty wild journey. So put on your seatbelts, because it's going to be a wild ride. And what we're going to do with this time together is try to look for a four-letter word embedded in all that you're about to see. And that four-letter word is S-E-L-F. Self. And I'd like you to really soak that in and see how it feels as we go through this journey. So the first thing to say in relationships, mind, and community is that we have this incredible challenge at this moment in humanity, that we've gone in a certain direction, we've taken contemporary views of what the self is, and we've come to a place that, as I think we all can feel, isn't working so well. And what I'm going to join you with in this brief time together is what might be going on and what we might do as a collective human family to actually put things in a different direction. So on the next slide, this is there, and these are slides that our daughter Madeline Siegel made, and they're in the next book, Aware, The Science and Practice of Presence. This has embedded in it, even though the word self is not there, something for us to consider, that the mind is in fact not something that we've been told for 2,500 years since the time of Hippocrates as something that comes only from your brain. So Soren had said, Dan, why don't you talk about neuroscience and community? And neuroscience is great, but there are so many other sciences to draw upon. One example would be anthropology, studying how we are shaped by culture, or sociology, studying how we form groups and have a sense of belonging, or psychology, studying the nature of the mind, not just as brain activity. So here we're going to use the term embodied brain to remind ourselves that, in fact, the body is an inner source of our subjective experience, not just the head. So that's a first take-home message that may be different from what you usually hear. And the second part of this triangle, this relationship side, tells us, in fact, that when you look at the deep science of our connection with each other, we've missed this in many, many ways when we think about the self. That the relationships we have with each other, close by relationships, family members, friends, with people who are like us and people who are not like us, and even living beings who are not in our species, those relationships, it turns out, are the essence of not just living well, but even of well-being. So we want to look deeply at what that means, our relationships with other people and the planet, and that the mind, in fact, can be seen in some very deep ways as a product of both what happens within you and between the inner you and the inter you. So what could it be that could be one thing that's both within and between, that's part of this mind system? What could it be? And the answer is in the middle of this triangle. One answer is energy and information flow happens within you, it happens in your head, it happens throughout your whole body, and it's happening right now between this body and your bodies. And it's happening right now in anyone who's watching this through streaming. It happened when you were talking to each other earlier. And there's a deep science to energy that we're going to get into right now that helps illuminate perhaps how we've gone wrong in contemporary culture. We'll come back to this triangle of human experience in just a bit. So you say, well, okay, what does the mind have to do with it? Well, strangely enough, every field, like my own as a psychiatrist, or I'm also trained in the psychological field of attachment research, there is no definition of the mind. Even the field of philosophy of mind says you should never define the mind, but we're going to offer a definition of the mind just because it's probably a good thing to do. And here's 4 facets of the mind. One is, the first one, subjective experience. This cannot be replaced in any way by saying it's brain firing, which has been said for a long time, because you have a felt texture of your lived life. And you'll see here at Wisdom 2.0, there'll be many, many ways where meditation teachers, embodiment practices, doing yoga, all sorts of ways of sensing your experience invite you to be aware of subjective experience. And that subjective experience is the essence of how we know ourselves in the inner sense, but also how we sense our relatedness. How do you know you're having a subjective experience? You go over to the second facet, consciousness, which itself may also, in addition to subjective experience, be arising from energy and information flows we'll soon see. And all of this doesn't have to happen in consciousness. It can happen outside of consciousness. So there's a broader thing which is called information processing. And we talk about information processing, we use the word cognition. It can be enacted and embodied, this internal aspect of it, but it can also be extended, like on your smartphones or your computers, and it can be embedded in a culture. So information processing is not just something that happens within. In technology, in the digital age, we are deeply shaping the kind of information processing that the human mind is emerging from, and we have a choice to make. If we have mind-neutral information processing that doesn't honor skillful means of connecting with each other with empathy and compassion, with morality and a sense of integrity, then all we're doing is promoting a very thin way that we connect with each other and comport our lives. So part of this is to say, well, what would be something that would explain how ethical ways of living, skillful means, how being compassionate, how does that fit in with what you do with computers? What would it mean to have compassionate technology? Or technology that's respecting our need to sense the suffering of others, to imagine how to support them in reducing that suffering. And that's where you get to the 4th facet of mind, which in effect is a definition, which is self-organization. As some of you may know, self-organization is a mathematical term. It comes from the mathematical study of systems, specifically complex systems, and you know that complex systems, which are open to influences from outside themselves, capable of being chaotic, and non-linear, meaning small inputs lead to large and difficult to predict results, lead to an emergent set of properties. It just arises. You don't need to program it. And one of those properties is called self-organization. And amazingly, you can look at the mind as an embodied and relational emergent self-organizing process and understand why, if we as a human family don't shift what we're doing with our information processing, we could easily destroy life on Earth. It relates to self-organization, and let's take a look at how that might happen. The simplest way to think about that is that the mind has 2 distinct functions. One is it can function as a hose, like a conduit. So if you're going for a walk and you're just feeling the breeze on your cheek and letting yourself drop into sensation, that would be a kind of conduit function or conduition. In this diagram, it would be like just if your mind is the little loop where you're blowing bubbles, it would be just where the soapy water, this filmy water came through, and all it produced was just bubbles, however they came out. And that's when you drop into sensation. But the mind is also a constructor that takes that energy and information and constructs it. So energy patterns with symbolic value are called information. It's like energy information. So here you see the bubbles can form a symbol for 2, a symbol for addition, the plus sign, and a symbol for 3. Same stuff, energy, but in this case, it's constructed. So let's keep our minds on that, because soon we're going to see how modern culture gets us to construct a sense of self that may actually be wrong. And not only wrong, it may be so embedded in who we think we are that we don't even know it is taking us over individually and collectively and actually killing us. That may actually be a construction, and the fantastic thing about it being a construction is we can deconstruct it and liberate a constructed view of the self that may be actually more accurate and more helpful to human life and life on this planet. So let's see how that would work. When you look at this conduition and construction, and you study all sorts of things, and this is in all the different books I write about this subject, so this is just a simple summary slide. It turns out that you can say what optimal self-organization is. So if one facet of the mind is a self-organizing process, you can then ask, how do you get optimal self-organization, which has 5 features. It's flexible, spells the word faces, by the way, flexible, adaptive. It has the mathematical quality of coherence, which is resilience over time. It's energized, and it's stable. This faces flow is like the flow of harmony. There's a huge amount of science behind that, but we're just going to get to the take-home message, which is if you are not doing what's necessary to promote optimal self-organization, which I'll have you consider is happening now on this planet, then what happens to the individual, to the relationship you have one-on-one, or to the family, or to the community, or to the nation, or to the entire ecosphere, is you get chaos and you get rigidity. This is straight out of math. Complex systems which don't allow optimal self-organization move towards chaos or rigidity. Then you can say the natural question is, well, then how do I promote optimal self-organization? How do I develop that flexible, adaptive, resilient, coherent way of being that's energized and stable? And it turns out there's an answer, and the answer is you differentiate and you link. And in common English terms, we'll use the term integration for how you optimize self-organization. So integration is defined in the way we're going to use it as the linkage of differentiated parts. So whether we look inside your brain and your head and study every psychiatric disorder that's ever been studied, the one finding that's been found across every disorder is impaired integration. If we look in my field, attachment research, at relationships that don't promote well-being, like with developmental trauma, it's impaired relational integration. And what does that do to the brain? It impairs the growth of integration in the brain. Why does that matter? Because integration in the brain and the whole body, in fact, is the basis for every form of regulation we have, regulating emotion, mood, affect, the expression of emotion, thought, behavior. So this graph, as simple as it is, actually explains your individual life with your mind as a self-organizing process and the life of the planet. Because when we don't honor the differentiated needs of different species of living organisms on this planet, and we assert a differentiated right to treat Earth like a trash can, what results is a chaotic world that we're experiencing right now. It's called a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's a term that's used in the military, it's used in the media. The VUCA world we're in right now, what I want to suggest to you, is coming because the human brain has a vulnerability to think that it's separate from the rest of living organisms. It's like I once attended a quantum physics think tank, we'll get into that in a moment, and the First presenter put up a slide, quantum physics has demonstrated that the world is profoundly interconnected. The real question is, what's wrong with the human mind that thinks it's not? And that's pretty funny and incredibly sad. And it's the issue of the quiz we're going to get into in a moment, what's the self? Because you may say, well, of course, the self that's me is sitting in this chair. Or the self that's Dan is up here on stage. And that view is so common and so misguided. Energy and information flow, if that's where the self is coming from, I'll suggest to you, is not limited by skull or skin. And yet we use the skin as a defining feature of who we are. And that is a toxic lie that is creating misery in humanity and misery for other living beings. And it's something we can do something about. So you may say, well, how do we do something about that? So on the next slide, you have a very simple practice which embeds a lot of the practices that you'll learn here at Wisdom 2.0. It's a very simple practice I've been doing for years, but it turns out to embed 3 of the pillars of mind training from a number of contemplative traditions that research has shown produce well-being. And those 3 pillars are training focused attention, training open awareness, and training compassion, which is really about our interconnectedness. It's about a kind intention. So you're going to train a form of attention, which is focused, awareness, which is open, and intention, which is kind and compassionate. These are trainable skills. So it turns out this wheel of awareness practice has all 3, but the wheel also has something else. So what the wheel is basically saying, hey, if integration is how self-organization creates well-being, and consciousness is needed for change, what would happen if you integrated consciousness? What if you differentiated the elements of consciousness and then linked them? So this is a table in our office at the Mindsight Institute, and basically what we would do is say, okay, let's put the knowing of awareness in the center of the table. It's like a glass center, like the hub of a wheel. And the rim are the knowns, like what you hear or see or smell or taste or touch in the first segment, the first 5 senses. You have the interior of the body called interoception. In science, we call that the 6th sense. And that's the way you develop focused attention going across this first half of the wheel, the rim. And then you go over to mental activities, and you open awareness to whatever arises. And then you explore your interconnections, the basis for compassion. So if you see the beautiful teachings from Roshi Joan Halifax or Sharon Salzberger here, or John Kabat-Zinn, who's here, all these people, Jack Kornfield, Trudy Goodman-Cornfield, all these beautiful, wonderful teachers, what I want to suggest is that in part what's happening with those incredibly powerful wisdom traditions is, from a scientific perspective, is you are integrating consciousness. And what happened to me, I'll just say, Jack Kornfield and I were teaching one day up in Seattle. We go back and forth teaching meditation. We did this one reflective practice, this integrative practice. And then we took a break after we did it. And when we came back, a 70-year-old, just retired Microsoft engineer took the microphone at the break. Some of you may have been there. And he goes like this. He goes, my wife is a therapist. She brought me to see you 2 guys. And I don't know why she was bringing me. I'm a Microsoft engineer who just retired. I'm 70 years old. And I did that wheel thing. I've never meditated before in my life, and I've never had therapy. He seemed very proud of that. And he said, so I was doing the wheel, and then you had me take the spoke of attention, and we went around to the senses and the body and my mental activities. And then you had me bend the spoke of attention around. So I aimed it right into the hub. And then he starts to cry. And he goes, then something changed. And this is where the Seattle Needle was. And he goes, in the break we went out there, and I'm going to make this shorter. He took a long time to say all this in front of the 500 people there. But he said, so I go out there, And there's a man with a hose watering the roses, it's the gardener, and there's the butterflies and the birds and the sunshine and the flowers. And he goes, and he's crying now, we're all the same thing. And I started doing the wheel everywhere I went around the planet. And no matter what a person's meditation history was, or educational background, or anything, or whether they had therapy or not, they would have similar experiences. Not every time, but in every workshop, somebody would bring that up. I actually did this once. I was asked to go teach at a government body, a parliament in another country. We did the wheel for the parliamentarians, and at the break we were discussing what it was like. Then when we took a snack break, one of the parliamentarians comes up to me, and he goes, I didn't say anything during the discussion. I go, yeah, I noticed. He goes, you want to know why? I said, yeah, I'd like to know why. He goes, because when I bent that spoke around and got into that hub, and I go, oh my God, what's this? He goes, I have never felt so much love before in my life. And I was like, we were just standing, I was just looking at him, he's looking at me. And I go, okay. And so you didn't want to share that? He goes, oh no. If I were to tell any of my peers the love I felt, they would think I was weak. So I said, okay, I understand. You didn't want to seem weak. I said, but let me ask you a question. I said, after a bit of more pausing, I said, so when you make government policy, are you leaving love out of the decision-making? And then he starts wagging his finger at me, and he goes running over to his other parliamentarians. I don't know what they said. But the issue was, the issue is, what is going on? So let's go to the next slide. This is the part that seems to affect people the most, this bending of the spoke or retracting the spoke or leaving the spoke in. What is awareness? What in the world is awareness? And why, in fact, do all the neural correlates, the brain correlates of pure awareness and the brain correlates of pure love, why are they basically identical? Massive integration in the brain is what you see in both conditions. Why is love and awareness so overlapping? That's a grammatical error. Let's do it again. Why? Why is love and awareness, why are they so overlapping? Why is there so much overlap? So let's take a look at the next slide. Here is a quick quantum course in what I think is going on. So I was asked to speak at a conference as just a co-faculty member with 150 quantum physicists and mathematicians and other types of physicists. And I kept on asking them in this week we spent together, what is energy? Because if the mind is an emergent property of energy, then we ought to go to the scientists who study energy, right? Makes sense. And they said, well, energy isn't really something, it's a lot of different things. I said, but why do you use the word energy? And here's what they said. Energy is the movement from possibility to actuality. And I went, oh my gosh. Because now I've done the wheel systematically with 10,000 people, collected the results. Now I don't record it anymore, but when I was recording, it was quite amazing. My students would be blown away because they go to these conferences with me. People would describe when they got into the hub this incredible sense of expansiveness, the infinite eternity. They talk about God, about love, about joy. What's going on there? Here's what I think is going on. Here in this graph, this 3P graph, which you'll see why it's called 3P in a moment, you have the idea that probability is on the y-axis from the near zero point at the bottom up to the top of 100% probability. So that's the probability distribution curve you may be familiar with. Clock time goes on the x-axis across, and we'll have diversity, the number of things that can be present at a given moment of time, on the z-axis. Now, in this graph, you can actually, on the next slide, show how mental processes, including consciousness, can be graphed as an emergent property of energy. And it would look like this. A thought or an emotion or a memory might be a peak where you've actualized a possibility. Just beneath the peak, you would see thinking and emoting and remembering. You can even have a state of mind, like a self state, or some people call them parts of the self, that would be this particular state you're in that moment, that would be a plateau. So Dick Schwartz talks about this in Internal Family Systems, and we talk about a lot of this with trauma, of getting fixed plateaus that lock you in a prison of your own making, and the pathway out of that, we'll see soon, may involve dropping into what I think is going on is the hub, that metaphor for awareness. And with a million mights before this sentence I'm about to say, might be, might be, might be, it might just be that the awareness of consciousness comes when the energy probability position has dropped into this plane of possibility. And so whether you're doing mindfulness meditation or various forms of other reflective practices like yoga or embodiment or whatever, what I think they share in common is teaching us to drop beneath our incessant peaks and plateaus into this plane of possibility where consciousness arises. So on the next slide, you can see sometimes we can get fixed in these plateaus. For example, if my parents tell me, Danny, you live in this body, and just make this body the best it can be, and do well in the spelling test, and do well on your, getting into middle school and high school, and get into a really difficult college, and then get into the most elite graveyard or whatever the plan is. I'm living like a candle where I'm just the wax, and that's it. And I feel disconnected and meaningless in my life. And people tell me the way to really be happy is accumulate stuff. Get lots and lots of stuff. Just accumulate as much as you can. So I get 100 units of stuff. I don't really feel meaningful or connected or happy. So I want to get 1,000 units. Then that's not good. 10,000, 100,000. I'm just accumulating because I have been told, and it's embedded in a belief system of a plateau, that who I am in myself is separate. And I have this desperate drive to accumulate stuff for this separate self. But instead, you can see if you do a practice, and the wheel is just one of many, 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 many practices that are beautiful, beautiful practices, some new, some ancient. I think they're doing similar things in different ways of getting in, which is they're teaching people to distinguish the hub of being aware from the rim of what you're aware of. You're integrating consciousness. Now, why would that make a difference here at Wisdom 2.0? Why would this make a difference for the sense of the self? Here's why. Your rim contains your plateaus and peaks. That could be flexible. I mean, if I get in a car, I want to have a plateau of driving a car so I know how to steer and I know how to brake, I don't want to be just in the plane. I want to have my skills of driving a car. But if I don't know how to distinguish the hub from the rim, if I don't know how to drop my energy profile into the plane, then I'm going to have a meaningless life, a disconnected life. And I will treat the earth like a trash can because it doesn't matter. So on the next slide, and I'm saying that because I'm communicating with someone behind me, here we see a person who is trained with any of the reflective practices, the wheel is just one, where they've learned to allow the peaks of thought and feeling and memory to come straight from the plane without being restricted by a particular plateau, which only allows certain things. It's like a filter of consciousness. So if I haven't done a reflective practice, I could allow all the messages from the culture, from my teachers in school, from my peers, from my parents, and even ultimately from myself, that would be a plateau saying, Danny, you are a separate being. All it is the wax of your candle. That's it. That's it. And hey, be a shiny candle. So, you see the wick lit on somebody else, blow out their wick. Yeah, that's a good thing to do. And there's a wick lit up here, blow that wick out. So, hey, here I am. Let me get on social media and show you how happy I am. So, this is a real problem. I mean, this is for where we've come as a humanity to not be mindful that, in fact, who we really are as a self is something much bigger than just an isolated plateau. So, getting to the plane of possibility, accessing what it means to drop into awareness. And there are so many different terms you could use. We have to make sure we don't have a terminology war. You know, deep in the heart of many of these practices, if you think about it, accessing consciousness is accessing love. This plane of possibility is the generator of diversity. In a quantum physics view, it's the sea of potential. It's the quantum vacuum. It is that formless source of all forms. And I'm just speaking straight as a scientist. It's the generator of diversity. Make that into an acronym. So if that's the generator of diversity, and you can drop out of these plateaus that keep you from there. So every morning when I do the practice I happen to do is the wheel of awareness, and I do it, and I get into this spaciousness of the hub, which is the metaphor, I think, for the plane. What happens when, across all the different practices, when people do it like that Microsoft engineer or like that parliamentarian, when you drop into the hub, when you drop into this plane, you suddenly feel, not think. This is not a thought. It's not an idea. It's not a constructed notion. It is a conduit of reality. Our interconnected nature is the fundamental structure of the universe. Only these plateaus keep us from sensing it. So when you look right now around at each other, you are the same essential being manifesting as particular plateaus. Why is that the case? Of course, we all have a history. We all have particular proclivities for certain peaks to arise, for certain plateaus to be there. Fine. That's our differentiated nature. But what's the number, if there's a number associated with the plane of possibility? It's infinity. And your infinity, and your infinity, and your infinity, and your infinity, they're the same infinity. It is in the plane of possibility that we realize when you meet another person, even when you meet another living being, that being is you. That word you is problematic, and the word self is even worse. The self is a plural verb, not a singular noun. I gave away the answer to the quiz. So you say, well, hold on. Don't I have a body? Aren't all these studies saying I should sleep this body well, and I should exercise the body well, and I should feed the body all the right stuff to eat, not gluten for me, but all these things you're supposed to do with the wax body? Of course. So an integrated self would say, okay, yes, you want to differentiate the wax of your candle that you get about 100 years to live in. Great. But if you don't link together through the flame of your candle and realize we are the light beyond the wax alone, our job in life is to integrate life, to say, yes, I've got a waxy candle, that's my body, fine. But your mind is not just a kind of Newtonian classical physics, large objects, macro state body. It's actually also a quantum level micro state experience where there is no what's called arrow of time. There's no directionality of change. And where our interconnectedness is something you know is true. Even at the Newtonian level, the large object level, you want to have certainty. You get into an airplane. You don't want to ride on quantum airlines. You know, you don't want them to say, hey, we're getting on the plane in San Francisco, we're going to fly to Sydney. We'll probably get there. No, don't ride on Quantum Airlines. You want to be on Newtonian Airlines. So I was once at a meeting like this, someone who lived near Sir Isaac Newton's house said, oh my God, Dan, you know, you do the wheel of awareness, you get into this quantum experience of this expansiveness, this interconnectedness. I said, yeah, how was it? She goes, oh, it was amazing, but I live near Sir Isaac Newton's house. Please fly out here. I want you to do the wheel around the apple tree. And so we did it just recently. So we go there. I've got all these meditators there in town. They come to the apple tree. We're seeing Sir Isaac Newton's, the house he was born in, and when the plague was at Cambridge, he was there. Anyway, so we do the wheel practice. They drop into this hub. They get to this quantum level of the plane of possibility. And then afterwards, we have this discussion. So we called out to Sir Isaac. And we said, look, we understand all you knew, of course, was Newtonian physics. What else would Sir Isaac Newton think of? But now he'd probably be so excited to get at this level of microstate functioning. So on the next slide, we come back to our final slide, which basically comes back to where we began. Modern culture has given us a message that if we don't question the validity of this message, that the self is in your body, that is defined by your skin-encased body or your skull-encased brain, if we don't question that word self, we are in for deep, deep trouble. Human potential can be tapped when you get to this plane of possibility. When you drop out of those plateaus of a separate self, it's a win-win-win situation all around. Number one, you will access a sense of resilience and freedom that you won't believe is possible. Number two, you will come to be sensing, not just thinking about this, now we're talking about it with words, but sensing how deeply interconnected we are, like that Microsoft engineer who had no intention of having anything positive come out of that experience with Jack and me, but lo and behold, that's what happened. Or the parliamentarian, when we realize quite the opposite of what he said, where love is weakness, love and kindness are the strongest way of being as a human being we can have on this planet. And when you do these practices that for people who are new to a mindfulness practice or compassion practice or reflective practice, integrative practice, you get the sense we're all in this together, right? And when you realize, we as a human family have a moment in the chapter of our unfolding history to take a deep breath and say, through all the different ways we can, through the internet and the digital world, through our human connections one-on-one, through things we do in ways you can't even imagine their impact, we have the opportunity to embrace the true narrative of humanity is to realize the interconnected nature of reality. Our minds can do that. What does that mean? That means we say, yes, we have a wax-like body that has a long history of in-group, out-group distinction. And when we're threatened, we treat the out-group in a horrible way. We dehumanize them. And we take the in-group and we treat them kinder. Well, human consciousness, amazingly, research has proven this is possible. Human consciousness can rise above the genetically determined ways the brain has a proclivity to act, for example, with in-group, out-group distinctions. So if you look at the compassion training practices or the mindfulness practices and see how they reduce implicit racial bias, you'll see that I think what's happening is those practices are beautifully dropping people into the plane of possibility, out of those plateaus of implicit racial bias, and realizing how deeply interconnected we are. Now, to make an integrated self, we don't want to get rid of you taking care of your wax-like body. You get 100 years, you should enjoy it and treat it well. That's a me. But you are equally, the self of you is equally a we. So how in the world can we integrate the me and the we? We. If we come out of this conference talking about moi, talking about we will be the light beyond the wax alone. And integration like that made visible is kindness and compassion. And that's something we can create on this entire planet. Thank you very much.